So I've been asked by Girls Invent to talk a little bit about how I got here, which is essentially building video games about gender bias in the workplace. But I'll start at the beginning. Now, one of the toughest things for me as a young woman was when my family moved back to Alice Springs, where I'd been born when I was 14 years old. Now, I'd largely been raised in the US, and moving back to that tiny outback town was a lot harder initially than I'd anticipated. Now, my parents loved telling this story about how after the first week of being at school, I said to my dad, you know what, this has been a really interesting experiment, but I'm ready to go back to Washington, D.C. If you want to tell your boss, Daddy, that I'm ready for that, that'd be great. Now, they laughed, which is when I knew that I would have to just kind of sink or swim. So I'd had to adapt to a whole new system, a culture, lingo, and most importantly, friends. Now, I'm not going to lie, it was hard at times. But I moved on to the UK and I'm now in my 40s, and some of my closest friends ever are still girls that I knew from the years I lived in Australia. Now, I realized that because I was at a really small school, I could set myself apart as a good student. Now, I know that's a bit daggy, but I knew I also wouldn't be forever in Alice, so I just needed to get on with it. So I won English awards, I joined debate, and most importantly for anyone who wants to invent, I learned to reinvent myself, because if I could meet my teenage self again, I'd probably tell her, get comfortable with reinvention, because that's the way that modern careers actually go, even more than they were in my day. Now that, and the other thing I'd say is don't be afraid of moving country or house, something most parents shy away from when their kids are teenagers. The beauty is with a whole new audience, you can reinvent yourself because no one knows who you were before. I did it again when I went to university and then when I moved to Europe. And at each juncture where I've had a challenge, I've thought my initial reaction would be, yikes, I don't really know anybody here. But the beauty is they don't know me, so I can take the best of who I was from where I was last and just reinvent. I ended up doing my PhD at Cambridge, and most recently I reinvented myself when I began to develop video games about the effects of sexism and the lack of diversity in modern workplaces. And that's my work now. Tackling workplace gender bias has been the specialism of the company that I founded. Entering into gaming, well, that was a whole new reinvention. I had to take it to clients, get feedback, and keep redesigning based on what they were telling me. And I got a lot of no's in the process before I started getting to the yeses. Now, I love what I do because I feel like I'm making a difference to all the women who want to get ahead in their careers, but also for the women who are coming up just a few years behind them. Essentially, girls like you. Now, if I had one message for women across the world, it would be to think of yourselves first and foremost as inventors. Now, I certainly didn't used to think of myself that way, but the truth is, every time you invent yourself, when you meet people new, every time you move someplace new, every time you get a new job, that's every time you see a new problem worth solving. That's the place for reinvention. So don't ever labor under the assumption that invention is simply for old white men in lab coats, because it's not. We will only make more of a difference in this world if the people who invent are girls like you.